From New York, this is Democracy Now!
The president detailed, what the implications and consequences would be if China provides material support to Russia as it conducts brutal attacks against Ukrainian cities and civilians. And obviously that is something we will be watching and the world will be watching.
As President Biden speaks for nearly 2 hours with China's Xi Jinping, we'll look at China's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it could mean for U.S.-Chinese relations. We'll also speak to Professor Alfred McCoy, author of To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change. Then to Western Sahara, Africa's last colony, for an exclusive interview with a leading Sahrawi human rights defender, Sultana Khaya. She's been under de facto house arrest by Morocco's occupying forces for nearly 500 days. During that time, she's been the victim of rape and torture.
It's not the suffering of just 482 days, but it's suffering from a long period, since 1975.
Last week, a group of U.S. activists entered Sultana Khaya's home, breaking a 482-day siege. We'll also speak to Professor Stephen Zunis about how U.S. support for the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara has emboldened Vladimir Putin. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Ukraine has defied Russia's ultimatum that it surrender the besieged city of Mariupol by 5 a.m. Moscow time as attacks and casualties mount on day 26 of Russia's invasion. Mariupol officials said Russian forces bombed an art school Sunday that was sheltering 400 displaced people. Many residents of Mariupol remain trapped amidst heavy Russian bombardment and dwindling supplies.
We have been in a basement for 11 days. This is the 25th day of war. We have been counting every one of them. We hope for the best, to live as humans. The apartment has been broken. Everything is broken. Where can we go from the basement? We're cooking at a fire. For now we have some food and some firewood. In a week we will have nothing, no food at all. What should we do?
A powerful blast in the capital, Kyiv, earlier today destroyed a sprawling shopping mall. The number of victims from that attack is not yet known. Meanwhile, Moscow said it used hypersonic missiles twice in its attacks on Ukraine over the weekend. Residents in the city of Sumy were told to take shelter after Russian shelling hit a chemical factory, triggering an ammonia leak. Dozens of staff who've been working under Russian orders at the Chernobyl nuclear plant have been relieved and replaced by other Ukrainian personnel after working for around 600 hours. The UN said some 10 million people have been forced from their homes since the start of Russia's invasion. About a third of those are refugees, while the rest are internally displaced. The World Food Programme warned Ukraine's food supply chain is falling apart. Amidst the intensified fighting, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged direct talks with Vladimir Putin, but warned if those fail, quote, that would mean this is World War III.
The time has come for a meeting. It is time to talk. The time has come to restore territorial integrity and justice for Ukraine. Otherwise, Russia's losses will be such that it will take you several generations to recover.
Over the weekend, Turkey's foreign minister said Russian and Ukrainian teams made progress on their negotiations to end the war. Zelensky's also suggested Israel could help mediate peace talks between the two countries. President Joe Biden met virtually with Chinese President Xi Jinping on Friday for the first time since Russia's invasion. The White House said Biden warned Xi of consequences if China supports Russia's assault. Xi said Beijing is not planning to back the Kremlin in its war. Germany and Qatar have reached a deal on gas supplies as Berlin seeks to lessen its dependency on Russian energy imports. This comes as reports out of Washington say the Biden administration transferred a large number of Patriot anti-missile interceptors to Saudi Arabia in recent weeks as the U.S. pressures Riyadh to pump more oil. In China, a passenger jet with 132 people aboard has crashed near the southern city of Wuzhou in Guangxi province. State media reports rescue crews were dispatched after the plane crashed in a remote mountainous region, producing a massive fireball. Harrowing footage posted to social media appears to show the jet plummeting vertically towards the ground just moments before impact. A flight tracking website identified the plane as a Boeing 737-800. It's the model that preceded the troubled 737 MAX and has an excellent safety record. China reported 2 COVID deaths in the northeastern city of Jilin on Saturday, the country's first coronavirus fatality since January of last year. Jilin is the home of some 4.5 million people. It went into lockdown today. Tens of thousands of people across China have been ordered to stay home as the country continues to battle its largest surges of the pandemic. As cases in many Asian and European nations are on the rise, health experts say the BA.2 Omicron variant now accounts for 25% to 30% of new cases in the U.S. This is top White House advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci.
We likely will see an uptick in cases, as we've seen in the European countries, particularly the UK, where they've had the same situation as we've had now. They have BA.2. They have a relaxation of some of the restrictions, such as indoor masking, and there's a waning of immunity. Hopefully, we won't see a surge. I don't think we will.
Climate scientists are expressing alarm over record-shattering temperatures set near the Earth's north and south poles in recent days. In Antarctica, some regions soared as much as 90 degrees Fahrenheit above normal over the weekend. Meanwhile, temperatures near the North Pole soared to more than 50 degrees Fahrenheit above average last week, approaching the freezing mark in areas near the North Pole that were still shrouded in around-the-clock winter darkness. At least 25 migrants and refugees drowned after their shipwrecked off the coast of Tunisia Friday. Some 35 passengers remained unaccounted for. Most of the victims were believed to be from Syria and Tunisia. The International Organization for Migration says over 18,000 people have died or disappeared while attempting to cross the Mediterranean to Europe since 2014. The Biden administration has for the first time determined the Burmese military junta committed genocide and crimes against humanity against the Muslim minority Rohingya community. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's announcing the finding today at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The UN reports as many as 10,000 Rohingya were killed by Burmese forces during the 2017 genocide, though some estimates put the death toll at more than twice that number. Another 730,000 Rohingya were forced to flee Burma. Sri Lanka is seeking a bailout from the International Monetary Fund as it reels from its worst financial crisis since achieving independence in 1948. On Sunday, authorities announced 2 men collapsed and died while waiting in a line for fuel and energy shortages and soaring prices, which have driven the economy to record inflation. Millions of school students had their exams canceled due to a shortage of printing paper. Last week, protesters and opposition leaders marched through the city of Colombo to protest the handling of the crisis by the government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and his family. The Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are brothers of President Rajapaksa. This is one of the protesters.
We didn't come here asking to develop the country or any such thing. We can't live anymore. Because of the skyrocketing cost of living, we can't manage with our salary. We came to remove this government and bring a government that will help us.
The United States has suffered another weekend marked by gun violence in Norfolk, Virginia. 2 people were shot dead and 3 injured outside a restaurant Saturday. One of those killed was Sierra Jenkins, a journalist for the Virginian Pilot. In Arkansas, a gunfight at a community car show killed 1 person and wounded 28 others, including 6 children. At least 3 people were shot and killed at a North Carolina hotel. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been 107 mass shootings in the U.S. so far this year. South Carolina prisoners sentenced to death can now be executed by firing squad. Prison officials said Friday they're ready to carry out such executions after Governor Henry McMaster signed a bill last year which forces prisoners to choose between execution by firing squad or electric chair if the drugs needed to perform a lethal injection are unavailable. South Carolina joins 3 other states which also allow firing squad executions: Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Utah. In Washington, D.C., confirmation hearings start today for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, President Biden's pick for the U.S. Supreme Court. The former public defender would be the first black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. Jackson has received bipartisan support for previous judicial positions, but in recent days, Republican senators have attacked her over her record, accusing her of being overly lenient. In related news, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas was hospitalized Friday with flu-like symptoms. The court said Thomas, who is currently the longest-serving justice, was diagnosed with an infection, but that it is not COVID-19. He will not be participating in oral arguments today. In Texas, 175 wildfires have scorched close to 100,000 acres across the state in the past week. The Eastland Complex fire, raging west of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, killed at least 1 person, destroyed at least 50 homes, and displaced hundreds. And in Los Angeles, climate activists joined indigenous land and water protectors Friday in a march on City National Bank, demanding it divest from the Coastal GasLink pipeline in British Columbia. Leading the protest was Adam McKay, director of the hit Netflix film Don't Look Up. McKay and Hollywood A-listers, including Meryl Streep, Mark Ruffalo, and Leonardo DiCaprio, say they'll pull their money out of City National unless its parent company, the Royal Bank of Canada, ends support for the pipeline that's being built on sovereign Wet'suwet'en First Nations land. Indigenous activist George Funmaker also joined Friday's protest.
This pipeline threatens their drinking water and the air and all the other detrimental effects of drilling and the pipeline, like many other poor communities here in Los Angeles who's affected by the oil refineries and the bad air. So just in that same sense, the Wet'suwet'en people are fighting for clean air and clean water, clean land.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Coming up, Professor Alfred McCoy on China's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it could mean for U.S.-Chinese relations. Stay with us.
Y manteníamos la distancia. A veces estabas diferente, pequeñita pero intuitiva. Te buscaba, no te identificaba. Y te perdí la confianza. Creías que no me iba a afectar.
Buscando tu mano by the Ukrainian salsa band Dislocados. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke for nearly 2 hours Friday, with much of the discussion focused on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Biden reportedly warned Xi that China will face consequences if it provides material support to Russia. It was the first call between the 2 leaders of the world's 2 largest economies in 4 months. In February, Russian President Vladimir Putin traveled to Beijing for talks with Xi ahead of the invasion. Earlier this month, China joined India, Iran, Pakistan, and 32 other nations from the global south in abstaining from a United Nations vote condemning Russia's war in Ukraine. On Saturday, China's vice foreign minister criticized NATO as a, quote, Cold War vestige and criticized Western sanctions on Russia, saying globalization is being used as a weapon. To look more at China's evolving relations with both Russia and the United States, we're joined by Alfred McCoy, professor of history at University of Wisconsin-Madison, author of numerous books, most recently To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change. His recent article for The Nation is headlined, Russia and China Together at Last. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Professor McCoy. Why don't you start off by responding to the talk that President Biden and Xi Jinping had on Friday, what we learned of what they said?
Apparently what what President Biden was hoping to accomplish in his phone conversation with Xi Jinping was to draw on their successful video meeting last November and kind of encourage or even pressure President Xi to back away from China's strong support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that did not happen. President Xi's quote, the most memorable, the most important quote, was he wanted the United States to untie the knot of Ukrainian and Russian security. And that was a kind of oblique reference to the idea that the United States and NATO are responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine by expanding NATO right up to the borders of Russia and threatening Russian security. And that's also a reference to the historic meeting between Putin and Xi Jinping on February 4th of this year, when the two met during the Winter Olympics, and they issued an historic 5,300-word declaration that laid claim to establishing a kind of new global order, to attacking U.S. global hegemony, and to build upon their strong bilateral alliance, their very close economic integration in the field of energy, and to simultaneously block NATO from threatening Russia and block the United States from supporting Taiwan against China's legitimate claims to Taiwan. And so, in effect, what that meeting failed to accomplish was it simply failed to break this emerging alliance between China and Russia, which is literally shaking the current world order.
I wanted to turn to Qin Gang, the Chinese ambassador to the United States, appearing on CBS's Face the Nation Sunday. He was questioned by Margaret Brennan.
Has Xi Jinping, your president, told Vladimir Putin to stop the invasion? Do you condemn it?
Actually, on the second day of Russia's military operation, President Xi Jinping did talk to President Putin.
Was that their last
asking
phone call?
President Putin to think about resuming peace talks with Ukraine. And President Putin listened to it, and we have seen 4 rounds of peace talks have happened. Let me continue. China's trusted relations with Russia is not a liability. Actually, it's an asset in the international efforts to solve the crisis in a peaceful way, And China is part of the solution. It's not part of the problem.
Professor McCoy, can you respond to the significance of what the Chinese ambassador to the United States said?
Of course. He's, again, kind of affirming what President Xi said in that meeting last Friday with President Biden. In essence, that China is not going to rupture its relations with Russia. It's not going to apply pressure on Russia. It's not going to blame Russia. It's not going to call the Russian invasion of Ukraine an invasion. And it is going to affirm that Russia has legitimate security concerns in Ukraine that must be met, and that if China is going to do anything, it is going to apply its considerable international power and prestige to support Russia in establishing its security in Eastern Europe. What I think was going on more broadly is that we're seeing a sense of extraordinary confidence from Moscow and Beijing that literally history and, more importantly, geopolitics is on their side. They believe that their alliance gives them such dominance, such power on the massive Eurasian landmass that they can prevail, that they can not only dominate the landmass, they can dominate international politics. In essence, they are pursuing a geopolitical strategy to break U.S. control over the Eurasian landmass and thereby break U.S. global power. They think that they are witnessing the birth, the historic birth of a new world order in which the great global hegemon, the United States, which has dominated the world for the past 70 years, in which its global power is broken and its dominance over Eurasia, something the United States has maintained since the start of the Cold War in the early 1950s, that is coming also to an end.
This is the White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki talking about Biden's meeting with Xi Jinping on video phone call.
The movement of China to align with Russia, or to, the movement of them to align with Russia, or their proximity of moving closer together, is certainly of great concern to us, as we have expressed. And we are not the only country that has expressed that concern, including many other members of the G7 have expressed exactly that concern. So this is part of the discussion. It has been an ongoing part of the discussion. Expect it certainly would be when the president goes to Europe next week, but we're not in a place at this point to outline the specifics. We're still discussing.
So if you can talk more about, Professor McCoy, what Biden threatened, if it has an effect. He's going to Europe this week. He's speaking with a lot of European nations today, then meeting in Brussels with other NATO members, then going to Poland to hold bilateral talks Friday and Saturday. What this means for Russia, and then for Russia and China.
The United States is concerned, I think, in two areas. One, that China will provide weaponry and financial support. And in fact, China can break the financial embargo that the United States is trying to impose upon Russia in order to restrain them in their invasion of Ukraine. And so what Washington is monitoring is flows of weapon and flows of financial support from China to Russia. That's what the United States is trying to restrain. And that the weapons may have a short-term impact, the financial flows a medium-term impact. That's the U.S. concern. But I think we need to sort of analyze the situation in dual tracks. One, focus on the diplomacy, the military activity in Ukraine, the course of the war on the battlefield, okay? That may or may not go Putin's way. But underlying that, there is this extraordinary confidence in Moscow and Beijing that the geopolitics of Eurasia are on their side, that because of their alliance and their dominant position in this great landmass that comprises 70% of the world's population and productivity, that it almost inevitably that they are going to emerge as the new centers of global power on the planet. And that, I think, is underlying their boldness and their resistance to Washington's pressure. So we can, from their perspective, we can provide weapons. We can mount financial pressure. We can even impact the situation on the battlefield by providing anti-tank missiles and handheld weapons that can bring, like Stinger missiles that can bring down Russian helicopters and aircraft. We can do all that, but that is not material. That's not what's going to matter. They believe, because of the theory of geopolitics, that being the dominant powers in this great Eurasian landmass, that they can slowly break the controls that the United States has imposed over Eurasia since the start of the Cold War. And they can break U.S. global power, and they together can construct a new global order. Every global hegemon, and that's the word that Beijing and Moscow use, every global hegemon for the last 500 years, from the Portuguese to the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the United States, and now the Chinese, have done one thing in common. They have all dominated Eurasia. The Their rise to global power, including the U.S. rise to global power after World War II, was accompanied by dominance over Eurasia. And decline of all of these global powers, including the United States, has been marked by their declining control over Eurasia. And together, Beijing and Moscow are pursuing a strategy that I call, push, push, punch. So they're pushing at these great chains of geopolitical control that the United States has ringed around Eurasia since the Cold War. Naval fleets, air bases, mutual defense pacts. They're pushing slowly at the east and west ends of Eurasia, hoping to strain and break those chains of control that the United States has imposed over Eurasia until, in a succession of these punches, those chains of control snap, U.S. dominance over Eurasia comes to an end, and correspondingly, in the theory of geopolitics, U.S. global power also declines.
So, Professor McCoy, one of the key reasons binding Russia to China, in addition to what you've been talking about, is that Russia is a major energy exporter. China is one of the world's leading energy importers. Put that together with the Wall Street Journal reporting last week, Saudi Arabia is in active talks with Beijing to price some of its oil sales to China in yuan, a move that would dent the U.S. dollar's dominance of the global petroleum market. China buys more than a quarter of the oil that Saudi Arabia exports. If priced in yuan, those sales would boost the standing of China's currency. Can you talk about the significance of both the currency and energy politics?
Sure. One of the foundations of U.S. global powers, right since the end of World War II, has been that the dollar has been the functional global reserve currency. That was set at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. In 1971, when President Nixon ended the automatic convertibility of dollars to gold, Saudi Arabia announced that they would keep conducting their petroleum transactions in dollars. And since oil is the most negotiated of all international commodities, if the world is doing its oil business in dollars, that means the dollar has that continuing support as global reserve currency. Since 2015, the Chinese currency has become a part of the international basket of currencies recognized by the International Monetary Fund. And as China's dominance over the global economy grows, and it becomes the world's largest economy, the Chinese currency's role in that international economy is going to increase. And once the dollar declines, that is the most negotiable, the most visible part of U.S. global dominance. That global dominance will follow the decline of the dollar downward.
How do you see all of this playing out, Professor McCoy?
Short term, I think that what we're looking at is a kind of a parallel what happened with the last time China and Russia were allied. In the early 1950s, Mao Zedong went to Moscow. He was a supplicant. He formed an alliance with Joseph Stalin, and Joseph Stalin cashed in that alliance very quickly by using China to enter the Korean War. China fought in Korea for 3 years. It cost them about 40% of China's budget, 200,000 dead Chinese soldiers. What we're looking at is kind of a reprise of that. Putin comes to Beijing in February in the Winter Olympics. He's now the supplicant. He needs China's diplomatic and economic support for his Ukraine invasion. And so at the moment of this very strong alliance, again, this time Putin attacks. He's sacrificing his budget, his soldiers, all right, in this strategy of pushing and breaking the U.S. dominance over Eurasia. I see long-term the growing power of China over the Eurasian continent, their Belt and Road Initiative, this $1 trillion development program that now incorporates around 70 nations in Eurasia and Africa, laying down infrastructure, pipelines, railroads, and roads, across the whole Eurasian landmass. If this development project succeeds, and it's 10 times the size of the Marshall Plan that the United States used to rebuild Europe after World War II. It's the biggest development scheme in human history. If this scheme works in laying down infrastructure of rails, pipelines, and roads across the Eurasian landmass, and that draws the commerce of Eurasia, home to 70% of the world's population, towards Beijing, then almost as if by natural law, power and prestige and global leadership will flow towards Beijing. And so what we're witnessing is the violent eruptions of a great tectonic shift in global power. As US global power declines, China ascends, power shifts from the West, from Europe and the United States, towards Asia. And we're witnessing then an historic change that is for I'd say by 2030, by the end of this decade, it will become clear that US global power is eclipsed, that power has shifted to Beijing on the Eurasian landmass, and they are the new global hegemon. Constructing a new kind of world order, far less concerned with human rights, far less concerned with law, a kind of transactional world order of mutual convenience.
We're going to leave it there, but it's certainly a discussion that we will continue. Alfred McCoy, professor of history at University of Wisconsin-Madison, author of numerous books, most recently To Govern the Globe, World Orders and Catastrophic Change. We're linked to your piece in The Nation, Russia and China Together at Last. Coming up, we go to Western Sahara, Africa's last colony, for an exclusive interview with a leading Sahrawi human rights defender, Sultana Khaya, who's been under de facto house arrest for almost 500 days. A group of U.S. activists have just broken the siege on her home. Stay with us. Bord la Mer by the Sahrawi band Groupe Douai. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're joined by Professor Stephen Zunis of the University of San Francisco. He recently published an article in The Progressive headlined, The U.S. Hypocrisy on Ukraine. Zunis condemns the Russian invasion, but criticizes what he sees as President Biden's hypocrisy. He writes if Biden really believed countries have a right to self-determination, he would not refuse to recognize this right for Western Sahara, as the International Court of Justice in virtually every country on earth has called for, nor would he refuse to support Palestinian self-determination outside the parameters agreed to by their Israeli occupiers. That's Professor Zunis's words. He's written extensively on Western Sahara, which has been occupied by Morocco since 1975. In a few minutes, we're going to turn to an interview I did with a leading Sahrawi human rights defender on Friday, who's been under de facto house arrest since November 2020. But first, we turn to Professor Zunis. His books include Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Resolution. Welcome back to Democracy Now! As we see the Russian invasion of Ukraine play out, Stephen Zunis, talk about why you're talking about Western Sahara.
Well, Trump formally recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara during his final weeks of his presidency. And like a number of impetuous Trump decisions, it was assumed that Biden would reverse it as soon as he came to office, particularly since a bipartisan group of congresspeople, career State Department officials, and allied governments were encouraging to do so. He's refused to do so, however. The United States is virtually the only country in the world, the only country to formally recognize Morocco's illegal annexation. If you look at maps from the United Nations, from Google, from Rand McNally, National Geographic, whatever, they're depicted as two separate countries. U.S. government maps, by contrast, show Western Sahara as part of Morocco, no demarcation between them. So when Biden says that Russia has no right to unilaterally change international boundaries, that countries cannot expand their territory by force, he's certainly correct, but he seems to think it's okay if you're a U.S. ally like Morocco.
So for those who aren't familiar with Africa's last colony, if you can explain very quickly how Morocco occupied Western Sahara.
Well, Morocco seized the territory in 1975 on the verge of its independence from Spain. And Western Sahara, its formal name is the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, has been recognized by well over 80 countries. It's a full member state of the African Union. So what Biden is doing is he's essentially recognizing the conquest of one recognized African state by another at a time when he's speaking sanctimoniously about how the world must unite against Russian aggression because it violates longstanding international legal norms. The International Court of Justice, the United Nations Security Council, United Nations General Assembly, the Organization for African Unity, all called for withdrawal of Moroccan forces and an act of self-determination such as a referendum. But the United States has quietly supported the occupation ever since '75, and in 2020 made the recognition official.
And talk about why you also, in the same articles, talk about both Palestine and Western Sahara. And then there's a link with Trump pushing Morocco and accepting their power over Western Sahara.
Well, the United States is also the only country in the world that has formally recognized Israel's illegal annexation of Syria's Golan Heights. We've made a de facto recognition of Israel's annexation of Greater East Jerusalem. And since the Trump administration, we have considered the illegal settlements as part of Israel. And so there's a link there, but we're not talking about a whole nation when we're talking about Western Sahara. And what's interesting, and this development just happened last week, we had thought we had scored a great victory when Congress blocked U.S. military cooperation with the repressive armed forces of Morocco until Morocco agreed to find a mutually acceptable political solution to Western Sahara. But the Biden administration just recently claimed that Morocco had done so via their dubious autonomy plan, which denies the people their right to self-determination, as the United Nations World Court has demanded. It rules out independence and makes permanent the occupation. I mean, if Russia conquered 80% of Ukraine and offered some vague form of autonomy under Russian sovereignty, would Biden find that it constitute a mutually acceptable political solution? But this is what U.S. policy is. And again, we are a big outlier here, just as we're trying to lead the world in upholding these international legal norms against the expansion of territory by force.
As we talk about occupied Western Sahara, I want to turn to an exclusive interview I did on Friday with the prominent Sahrawi human rights defender Sultana Khaya, who's been under de facto house arrest since November 2020, along with her mother and her sister. She's been forcibly confined to her home for nearly 500 days. The Khaya sisters say they were raped last year by Moroccan agents in front of their 84-year-old mother. The agents also stole mobile phones, destroyed belongings, threw trash, urine, and a noxious black liquid into the family's drinking water storage tank. Last week, a delegation of U.S.-based activists arrived at the family's home to break the 482-day siege. In a moment, we're going to go to our interview, but first I want to turn back to 2016, when Democracy Now! Broke the international media blockade by reporting from occupied Western Sahara. During our trip, we spoke to Sultana Khaya, who described losing her eye as a college student after being beaten by Moroccan security forces during a protest in 2007.
One of them recognized me, and he jabbed right at my eye with his baton. When he did that, I bent over and I could feel my eyeball in my hand. I was yelling at him, "Hey, you Moroccan, you pulled out my eye."
In reporting in Western Sahara, Moroccan forces violently disrupted a protest led by Sultana and other Sahrawi women. I spoke to her again just after she was beaten then. We follow Sultana Khaya into a small bedroom. She pulls back her milfa, her traditional Sahrawi robe, and shows me fresh bruises on her leg, both arms, and on her breast.
They were insulting us, beating us, dragging us, and using violence to let us know that we weren't going to be able to protest. They tried to single us out and pushed us into narrow streets where they could beat us without anyone observing. What you saw today is nothing compared to what we've witnessed over and over since 1975. But the news never gets out.
That was Sultana Khaya in 2016. On Friday, I spoke to her, along with Adrienne Kinney. She's the former president of Veterans for Peace in the United States, a former Army sergeant who worked in military intelligence. Adrienne and 3 other activists with the Human Rights Action Center helped break the 482-day siege on Sultana's home imposed by Moroccan occupation forces. A warning, this interview contains graphic descriptions of rape and torture. I began by asking Adrienne Kinney about what happened when she entered Sultana's home last week.
When we showed up here to Sultana's house, we could see the evidence of the destruction of the Moroccan police. And we knew they had left the corner they had been sitting on for the last 482 days because people started flooding into the home with rugs and laughter and excitement to see each other and to be free and to be in community with one another. And that has honestly been the last 3 days, 2 days. I don't even remember how many days it's been, but it's honestly beautiful, and people need to know what's happening here.
Did you see Moroccan forces outside the house? Is the house surrounded right now?
So we've been watching the house, watching outside. We've seen people sitting. There have been attacks against people outside of this home. And there's definitely a presence. We've received reports that many cities in Western Sahara are on lockdown, that the checkpoints on the roads have been, there were already so many. I just was astounded at how many there were, but they are strengthening their presence, but they are also, I think, doing it from a bit of a distance because they know people are watching and they are trying to figure out their next steps.
I was wondering, Adrienne Kinney, if you could put Sultana Khaya on the phone, I'd like to ask her about this last over 480-day siege to her home and if she can describe what has happened to her during that time.
هي الحقيقة معاناة ما هي إلا معاناة 482 يوم هي معاناة سنين في سنين.
It's not the suffering of just 482 days, but it's suffering from a long period since 1975.
وهي كتجربة لهذه التجربة كيف أي صحراء.
My story is just one story of all the Sahrawi women that suffering every day under occupation, Moroccan occupation. I'm just a simple example of Sahrawi women, and all the Sahrawi women lost their children under occupation and lost many things. Actually, we are suffering under occupation. My experience with my sister and my mom in our house, my family house was like a prison for us for this period of time, and they practiced all kind of torture against us, rape, torture, abuses, everything you imagine. I want to thank the American delegation. Just 2 days, they bring us liberty and freedom to make the police have a circle, because they still in neighborhood, surrounding the neighborhood, but not surrounding the house like before. And now many people tried, but sometimes they successful, sometimes they fail to reach the house. But now Sahrawi as the many were with us. This delegation just for people, and brought happiness for thousands and thousands of Sahrawi.
يعني الصحراء في كل مكان، سواء في اللجوء، سواء في الجزر المحتل، سواء في الشتات.
I want to thank American people, and I want to ask and to push the American government and the president not to do like the last one, to care and to give to push to get our rights. We are waiting a referendum since a long time, since 1991, and 30 years of suffering and occupation, and no one cared about that. It was a hard experience, by the way. They practiced all kind of torture, rape, injection. They injected me twice. They many rights, 6 rights on the house. They destroy all the furniture, everything inside the house. During these 482 days, they practiced all kinds of torture against us, and we are just a peaceful woman, just 3 women. They didn't let anyone to enter the house. They isolated us, and no one cared about us. That's why many people they surrounding the neighborhood and the house, and we can't have any support from outside. Actually, that's why our voice try Morocco to isolate us, and even though we keep resisting and resisting, during the 6 raids on the house, they came sometimes 60, sometimes 80, sometimes 120 men covering their faces. All of them are from Moroccan authorities, different categories. They covering their faces. We believe in the peaceful process. They come to us like soldiers, and they rape us with their fingers. Not one, many of them. It's become like a turn. One of them raping, and one with their finger, and they practiced all that kind, and sexual harassment and anything that, and they destroy the tank of the water inside the house. They without electricity. All this we face it during that period. I can talk without describing the whole story, actually. And also when they raids on the house, they throw the toxic substances inside the house, which is a poisoned substances with a bad smell, and they destroy all the furniture. This is the occupier do it in many places around the world, not Morocco first. Actually, they do it in Palestine, in many places. We can't sleep during all the nights. We suffer from insomnia because we are afraid they will raid on us. And all the agents outside the house, they keep knocking on the windows and on the gates, not to make us sleep, because they want to play on our souls.
نعود واقفة مع النافذة، نخرص تعود نص الليل أنا وشقيقتي، ونخرص اللي حولية كامل، يعني عنه لا أقدم وتسمعونك، ونحياتي لك اللحظة على واقفة.
When I saw from the window all the people in the neighborhood sleeping, and we are just wake up. It's a really shame. It's really hard for us to see this situation, and the agents surrounding every night our house.
Sultana Khaya, why do you think that the authorities have targeted you and your family?
تستهدفني وتستهدف أي صحراوي قطعا على الاستهداف.
They targeted all the Sahrawis. The Moroccan authorities, they targeted all the Sahrawi, not me. I lost my eye in a demonstration in 2007. I'm a victim, and actually there are a lot of victims from Sahrawi people suffering from 1975 when Morocco invaded us.
هذا الاستهداف قول عن
We don't have any freedom or we don't have anything. We need to prepare freedom and liberty for the next generation, not live like us under occupation and we are suffering. We want something for the future, not to keep this process, and we do it in a peaceful way.
Sultana Khaya, President Trump recognized Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara in December, right before he left office. He recognized the occupation in a tweet. But President Biden has not rolled it back. What message do you have for President Biden?
أنا رسالتي اللي الحقيقة ذيك التقليد اللي عند الطرام أنا كنت تحت.
Sultana said that when Trump tweeted, I was under house arrested. That's why we become shocked as Sahrawi people here, and we see the Moroccan when they thought that now Western Sahara by Twitter in his hand become be more aggressive, and I want to send a message to Biden that we still believe in a peaceful process. We need just to push the process and push more pressure on Morocco to stop this violation. The ceasefire now is stopped. We have more things happening in this land. We need just our rights, which is referendum. We are waiting from it since a long time. Actually, we need from Biden to stop the suffering that's the Sahrawi people facing, and actually there is a people here waiting since a long time for a referendum, and from a long time this process is still continue. Never a tweet or anything will give Western Sahara. Western Sahara is recognized since a long time. That's it's not a governed place. We are waiting a referendum, and we still believe in the peaceful process.
And let me ask you, we are talking to you in the midst of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The President of the United States, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, other NATO nations have all reiterated that sovereign lines, the borders of countries must be respected. Do you see parallels here between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what Morocco has done with Western Sahara?
عندي شفت عكس كبير بين
we are absent in many details around the world. Actually, the case of the Sahrawi happened 1975, and the situation of Ukrainian people happened in 2022. And many people heard about the suffering of Ukrainian people and the situation of invasion of Russia to that country. And we are invited in 1975. We share the same thing with the Ukrainian people. All the things practiced on us from Moroccan people and from their regime. They throw the napalm, the phosphor, pumping the Sahrawi civilian and everything. All the Sahrawis are each story of suffering actually, and we want from the world to hear about. We want to just to live in a peaceful. Each country living in a peaceful. That's why not a strong country invited another country. It's a really we become like nothing actually. We are human. We are believing in the same blue planet. And also, Sultana, I want to mention that there is actually a war now between Moroccan and Polisario France, and that's why they make the Sahrawi people not to believe in a peaceful process anymore.
I want to end with back with Adrian Kinney, the past president of Veterans for Peace. As you entered the home of Sultana Khaya with this delegation of volunteers from the United States in the midst of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, your thoughts on the parallels between Russia invading Ukraine and Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara? And then what are your plans at this point?
I have been asked by children here even what my thoughts are about what is happening in Russia and Ukraine and what is happening here with Morocco and the Western Sahara. And the only thing, there are so many thoughts in my head. We hoped that with the whole world watching what is happening in Ukraine, that perhaps they will see the hypocrisy of what is happening here in Western Sahara. I just implore the press around the world to please come and witness what is happening here in the last occupied African country that is longing for its own right to self-determination and freedom, and that is the same right that every single person should have. Everybody should have a right to their own home and to their own homeland.
And Adrian, what are your plans? How long will you be staying there in Bushdor in the house of Sultana Chaya and her family?
We have planned to make sure that, inshallah, people will be here for as long as we need to be, in whatever form that takes.
That was Adrian Kinney, the former president of Veterans for Peace, with the prominent Sahrawi human rights defender Sultana Chaya, who's been under de facto house arrest since November 2020. Last week, Adrian Kinney and 3 other activists helped break the Moroccan siege on Sultana's home in Bushdor, Western Sahara. That's in northwestern Africa, right below Morocco. Sultana was speaking in Hassaniya, which is a Sahrawi dialect of Arabic. Still with us is Stephen Zunis, professor at the University of San Francisco. His books include Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. On Friday, I wanted to get your response to the significance of what has just happened there in Bushdor, and also ask you about what happened on Friday. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, abruptly changing Spain's historic position on the conflict in Western Sahara from supporting a UN-led solution that allows for the self-determination of the Sahrawi people to siding with Morocco by supporting a limited form of autonomy over the territory proposed by Morocco, the move shocking Spanish society since Spain was the former colonial power there.
Well, Spain's move was surprising. Spain has generally been part of the international consensus supporting the right of self-determination. This is Western Sahara is a big cause célèbre in Spain, so there's been a major negative reaction. I mean, this autonomy proposal, which the United States has been supporting for some time, in fact, was the support for this so-called autonomy plan was reiterated by U.S. Undersecretary of State Sherman just 10 days ago, is a joke, really. I mean, it basically allows for continued Moroccan occupation, does not meet the international definition of self-determination there, and as a non-self-governing territory, the Sahrawis have the right of self-determination, which must include the option of independence. So if this autonomy proposal does get international acceptance, it will be the first time since World War II, since the signing of the United Nations Charter, that a country has gotten away with expanding its border by force, and that a colony has been denied the right of self-determination. And this is particularly bad timing given the increasing repression. I mean, not only has Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch documented these the kinds of abuses that we've seen in terms of the Chaya family, but Freedom House, a U.S.-based group that has a quantitative analysis of relative human rights records, noted that of 210 countries in the world, Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara has the worst score in terms of political rights than any country in the world, save for Syria. And so, the idea that this autonomy is going to give the people of Sahrawi their rights, I mean, we've seen what happens when authoritarian states grant so-called autonomy to regions. We think of Ethiopia and Eritrea,
we have 5
Serbia
seconds.
and Kosovo. It doesn't come out well.
Professor Stephen Zunis teaches politics at the University of San Francisco. His books include Western Sahara, War, Nationalism, and Conflict Irresolution. Go to democracynow.org to see our documentary, 4 Days in Western Sahara, Africa's Last Colony. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe.